Today, let's take a look at a few clips, a few segments from Chris Hayes over at MSNBC, which, for those who don't know, this is a mainstream media network, has 6.7 million subscribers on YouTube, and we're going to be looking at a few videos from over the years. This one is from May 16th, 2022. Let's take a look at what Chris Hayes had to say back in 2022.
Good evening from New York. I'm Chris Hayes. We start this week in mourning and in shock after the brutal and sadistic murders of 10 people in a Buffalo supermarket over the weekend. They were victims of a single shooter and his gun, a poisonous vision of America. The racist idea.
A poisonous vision of America.
Ideas espoused in the shooter's white nationalist manifesto that the wrong kind of people, non-white people, non-Christian people, are coming into this country to replace so-called white Judeo-Christian values.
Yeah, and I think what Mr. Hayes is alluding to here is what is often called Great Replacement Theory, which is this conspiracy fantasy by a lot of white nationalist types. What I find interesting about this is that when you see a lot of white nationalist types, racist types, anti-immigration types talk about this Great Replacement nonsense, they often use the G word to describe it. They think that open immigration policies is genocidal. Even the American Jewish Committee has an article on this where they talk about how they perceive it as a genocide, which, to be clear, is just... It's pretty crazy stuff. But Chris Hayes continues.
Now, this vile racist conspiracy theory is as old as time. And the oldest fight in this country is the fight about who the we and we the people are, who counts as a real American. And on one side, there's a vision of America as a pluralistic society across lines of language, race, and culture and religion, all of us bound together by collective self-determination in the American creed.
Not sure if I agree with this framing somewhat false dichotomy, but whatever.
And on the opposite side is the idea of America as a white man's republic. We fought this fight.
My impression of America is that it's a country about freedom and individual rights.
America, fuck yeah! Right? In words, in politics, and on the battlefield over and over throughout our country's history. I have to say that 10 or 20 years ago, and this is anecdotal observation, I don't know if it's right, but it felt like there was some kind of enduring consensus, even among politicians who pushed destructive racist policies like mass incarceration. There was a consensus you at least to pay lip service to that former idea, right? That's the guiding ethos. We are, in fact, a pluralistic, multiracial, multi-ethnic society. And to be clear, the impact of those destructive policies wasn't in any way diminished by the softened rhetoric of the people pushing it. But it was nevertheless a kind of agreement rhetorically. Worth noting, for instance, that a president like George H.W. Bush, a Republican who won the White House on the back of that racist Willie Horton ad.
All right, so I'm not a fan of George H.W. Bush, but to suggest that he won his presidential election off of a racist campaign ad when he was following back-to-back Ronald Reagan landslides, I think is a bit dishonest. Then again, I'm no expert on the 1988 election, and you don't have to like Ronald Reagan. I have a lot of problems with the guy, but you don't have to like Ronald Reagan to acknowledge the fact that he was very popular. He was a very popular American president. I don't like Franklin Delano Roosevelt, but from what I can tell, he was pretty popular. He won 4 consecutive presidential elections. I think all of them were by landslides, but he definitely, his popularity definitely waned in each election. But yeah, so I think it's a little dishonest, but again, maybe Hayes has a point. But my impression is that George H.W. Bush was riding the winds, the popularity of Ronald Reagan.
Fear-mongering about a dangerous black man. Still felt as though it was necessary to denounce the former KKK leader David Duke when he was vying to become the next Republican governor of Louisiana back in 1991.
I'd encourage anything to help David Duke go away. His message of bigotry and his racism is bad. It's bad for this country, transcends politics. And it's so thinly veiled as to be really deeply ugly. And to the degree I have anything to say about the machinery of the Republican Party, I will see that it is fairly used to negate the influence of somebody who brings this kind of racial and bigotry, race prejudice and bigotry to the political scene.
But even that sort of professed respectability, right, this distance from that worldview started to disappear a few years ago. It was June 16th, 2015, that Donald Trump launched his presidential campaign, and he launched it by accusing Mexican immigrants, the nation of Mexico, in a sort of conspiratorial fashion, of sending criminals and rapists, right? And Trump's message was clear. Immigrants are destroying our way of life. We need to build a wall to keep them out. It was actually just one day later, I had forgotten this, but it was one day later on June 17th that a white supremacist brought a gun to Mother Emanuel Church in Charleston, South Carolina, and murdered 9 black churchgoers after they invited him in to pray. He later said the massacre was on behalf of his fellow white Americans. And to be clear, those two events are not directly related. But they are both examples of this line of thought that is now indisputably ascendant. The racist point of view that inspired the shootings in Buffalo and in Charleston also inspired a gunman to murder 11 and wound 3 more at a synagogue in Pennsylvania in 2018, and another to kill nearly 24 people and injure nearly 24 more at a Texas Walmart less than a year later. It's the same ideology, frankly, explicitly stated behind the marauders who took to the streets of Charlottesville.
So here Chris Hayes is bringing up Charlottesville, which I think happened in August of 2017. He's bringing this up again in 2022. And to be clear, I don't blame Chris Hayes for bringing this up. I don't have a problem with it. But pay attention, because I think we're going to see some double standards with Mr. Hayes here.
And the campus of the University of Virginia back in 2017 chanting infamously, quote, "Jews will not replace us."
So Chris Hayes seems a little alarmed by these protests 5 years after the fact.
And the message was heard loud and clear when Donald Trump defended them as, quote, "very fine people," even as one of them murdered a woman during the protest.
Not only that, but he's saying that these ideas motivate people to do horrible things, which, again, I think Chris Hayes has a point here. I don't have a problem with him. I don't have a problem with his analysis here. I do not have a problem with his analysis here.
I do think there's blame. Yes, I think there's blame on both sides. You had some very bad people in that group, but you also had people that were very fine people on both sides. You had people in that group, excuse me, I saw the same pictures as you did. You had people in that group that were there to protest.
Yeah, it looks like we got the watermark in the upper left-hand corner. So I was right, yeah, August 2017.
The taking down of, to them, a very, very important statue.
That's important there, that like very fine slicing of reality, right? Well, there's the really bad ones, but the ones who just wanted to protest to taking down the Robert E. Lee statue. Now, in the post-Trump world, the ubiquity of this racist messaging, this vision of the country belonging to some set of Americans, white Americans, right, is only growing on the right. And you can hear it on any given night on Fox News, especially from Tucker Carlson, who has dedicated segment after segment of his show to the dangers of immigration, the idea that they want to take your country away from you, that they are going to make it dirtier here. And it's become practically gospel among the dangerous far-right troll caucus in Congress. Congressman Matt Gaetz of Florida has pushed the line, as have Congresswoman Marjorie Taylor Greene of Georgia and Congressman Paul Gosar of Arizona, who pushed for a so-called America First caucus, which, as Punchbowl News reports, was linked to a document that argued American culture is, quote, strengthened by a common respect for uniquely Anglo-Saxon political traditions.
Now, again, I don't blame Chris Hayes for bringing this up and noting the fact that some Republicans have some troubling views, but might be worth noting, you know, earlier he made a big fuss about David Duke. Does Chris Hayes know who David Duke's favorite member of Congress is? It turns out it's Democrat Ilhan Omar, at least according to an article from 2019 on the Associated Press. And a reason for this is because of Ilhan Omar's hostility and contempt for Israel. And I don't bring this up to play the guilt by association game, but I don't know. Maybe I'd have to dig a little more, but I'm wondering where this level of scrutiny is with some Democrats. Especially with, as I pointed out before, the Democratic Socialists of America Democrats like Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and others. Dues-paying member of this organization that promotes Marxism and has chapters where they have Mao Zedong book clubs. Has Chris Hayes thought about how, if a Democrat is David Duke's favorite member of Congress, maybe the left has a little bit of spring cleaning to do? Maybe they have some things to rethink about?
Now, Green and Gosar tried to distance themselves from the document, but they also both appeared at a white nationalist conference organized by a right-wing extremist who has publicly cast doubt on the Holocaust. The event's website even contains a bold header on its main page reading, quote, "Our country is being destroyed. We're trying to save it." Now, many Republicans will say that the views of the party's fringe do not represent them as a whole. But that does not explain why Elise Stefanik, a member of party leadership, the third most powerful Republican in the House, ascending to that role with the backing of Donald Trump, ran an ad last year warning, quote, "Radical Democrats are planning their most aggressive move yet, a permanent election insurrection. Their plan to grant amnesty to 11 million illegal immigrants will overthrow our current electorate and create a permanent liberal majority in Washington." That ad resurrected over the weekend in light of Saturday's horrific shooting. And while Stefanik herself issued the usual condolences, today her spokesperson issued a statement in which she again raised the specter of outside forces overtaking American democracy, saying the Congresswoman, quote, "opposes mass amnesty for illegal immigrants and Joe Biden's wide open border." The border isn't wide open. She opposes.
Now, Hayes is actually right about that. The border, reason why there's a problem at the border is because of too many restrictions on legal immigration.
Is giving illegal immigrants the right to vote, which New York Democrats support, have made legal in New York City. Okay, fine. There's debate about immigration policy. That's perfectly fine. That's not what's going on in that ad. This view, fundamentally, is everywhere in the Republican Party, among the fringe and the establishment alike. And again, honestly, it's the view that animated the January 6th insurrection.
All right, so now he's bringing up January 6th. Now, let's just run with this for a second. Let's just give Hayes the benefit of the doubt here. And he's tying a lot of this to the Charlottesville protests and what happened on January 6th. 5 years after Charlottesville and over a year after January 6th, and he's still talking about it and the ideas that led to these events.
The racist idea that fake Americans, the wrong Americans, not real Americans, those Americans, the usurpers, the invaders, the replacers, have taken what's rightfully ours. It used to be a view that at least publicly was relegated to fringe message boards and right-wing talk radio. Not quite something a member of the establishment in good standing could just stand up and espouse publicly. But it is now increasingly the dominant view. And inevitably, violence flows from that.
Yeah, and violence flows from that. From these wacky ideas.
When people's hearts are so twisted by racism and hatred and the paranoid obsession their country is being stolen, taken away, well, what do? They begin to justify violence, murder, radicalized terror is the only solution.
Radicalized terror, huh?
And again, to be clear, I don't think anyone I just mentioned is intentionally inciting violence or mass murder. That's not really the point, because even if the violence doesn't happen,
so pay attention to this. He's divorcing the violent aspects from the ideas.
Even if this weekend had not borne witness to mass murder in a grocery store the shooter traveled to because of the black people there, even if that had not happened, it is still the case that this vile zero-sum view of American life,
zero-sum view, huh?
So popular right now, ascendant in one of our two major party coalitions, is.
Do any other political parties, do any other political coalitions also have a zero-sum view of economics or other aspects of American life?
Completely poisonous and incompatible.
It's completely poisonous.
You're goddamn right.
Again, Hayes is not wrong to bring this up.
The vision of a country that we all share together.
All right, that was one clip. We're also going to check out this clip. Now, this clip was from 2017. Just a 2.5-minute clip. Let's check it out.
This week it's Robert E. Lee. I noticed that Stonewall Jackson's coming down. I wonder, is it George Washington next week? And is it Thomas Jefferson the week after? You're changing history. You're changing culture. It's time to expose the crooked media deceptions and to challenge the media for their role in fomenting division.
So just for those keeping score, Chris Hayes, he likes to talk about Charlottesville and January 6th and some of the wacky ideas that may lead to these horrible protests. And we need to talk about them and how they might be poisoning one of the two dominant political parties in American politics.
And yes, by the way, they are trying to take away our history and our heritage. You see that.
The president and like-minded people like to argue that Confederate monuments are just about history and heritage rather than symbols of white supremacy. But you don't have to scratch too far below the surface to see which of those interpretations is the correct one. Case in point, what's happening in York County, South Carolina. Back in January, the county clerk of the newly renovated courthouse announced he was removing a Confederate flag and two pictures of Robert E. Lee and Stonewall Jackson from the courtroom, prompting a lawsuit claiming the removal violated the state's Heritage Act. This morning, a judge quickly dismissed the suit, pointing out the plaintiff, one Russell Walker, doesn't even live in York County or even in South Carolina.
Oops.
So, what was Walker's rationale for filing the suit? Well, here's what he told reporters earlier today.
I don't believe it's a symbol of racism. I don't believe it's a symbol of slavery. That's my personal view, but how they feel is their business. But it would be ludicrous for me to tell you how they feel.
He doesn't believe it's a symbol of racism or slavery, but then he let slip what he really thinks.
I don't believe it's a symbol of racism. I don't believe it's a symbol of slavery. That's my personal view, but how they feel is their business. But it would be ludicrous for me to tell you how they feel. Hey, I get down the street, I see Martin Luther King.
Oops.
I shouldn't have said it. Martin Luther King. I mean, should I rip the signs down or insist that they take Martin Luther King Street down and all the rest of that stuff?
Should I rip down the signs of Martin Luther King, who he called Martin Luther Coon? You know, when it comes to defending Confederate monuments, the most honest voices are the white nationalists and the Nazis who...
So, you know, again, back in 2017, Chris Hayes was really concerned about the protests at Charlottesville.
We're chanting blood and soil, and you will not replace us in a...
Blood and soil, huh? Have we heard some blood and soil rhetoric at some, I don't know, some other protests and activist antics as of late in the year 2024?
Torchlit march around a statue of Robert E. Lee in Charlottesville nearly 2 weeks ago. Those folks in those pictures, they are 100% right about what that statue stands for.
All right, so that's Chris Hayes when he covers Charlottesville and January 6th and great replacement theories. And now we're going to take a look at a clip of Chris Hayes. This was put up just the other day. Now on YouTube, it only has 43,000 views. On Elon Musk's website, this got 2.7 million views, 21,000 likes. And this is what Chris Hayes, this is his attitude on some of the anti-Israeli protests that we're seeing on college campuses throughout America.
In the spring of 1969, a group of students at Morehouse College, historically black college in Atlanta, were frustrated by what they said was the school's slow progress on civil rights. And they'd protested, they'd been rebuffed. So they locked the college trustees in their office for 2 days and essentially held them hostage.
They held them hostage.
Now, one of the trustees was Martin Luther King Sr., father of the recently slain civil rights leader. He began having chest pains, and one of the students later said, "We let him out of there so he wouldn't be accused of murder." That student and his classmates eventually...
Now notice the student here. We're going to, spoiler alert, we're going to find out that it's the actor Samuel L. Jackson, who's awesome. But if you notice the shirt that he's wearing, it looks like it's Angela Davis, the communist intellectual Angela Davis.
Uh-oh, SpaghettiOs!
You know, communism. Communism, one of the most horrible, destructive ideologies of the 20th century in human history.
He gave up under a promise of amnesty from the college. The college reneged, and he was expelled. It would be years before he was rehabilitated, decades before he became known the world over as actor Samuel L. Jackson. Now, I tell this story for two reasons. One, to remind us that college activism has long been a part of college education.
Yeah, you know, taking people hostage, university trustees hostage until your demands are met. Yeah, you know, it's part of the territory. You know, there's a tradition with this, with college students. Not to mention, going back to the Angela Davis shirt, I imagine Hayes, you know, because we've seen this in the segments with Charlottesville on January 6th. I imagine Hayes would not be as sympathetic if some MAGA hat wearing ass hats, maybe wearing a shirt of like one of the January 6 rioters who's in jail that said like free this prisoner or whatever. And imagine if someone like that took some hostages at a university until their demands were met. I imagine Mr. Hayes would not be as sympathetic here.
The other reason, though, is to get a sense of proportion, which seems lacking today. As we watch the disturbing imagery emerge from campuses at Columbia, UCLA, University of Texas, University of South Florida, so many others, where cops, or in some cases mobs, took down pro-Palestinian student encampments and protests.
Oh, I guess that was the problem. Wasn't the encampments? You know, I just did a whole video on this last week where I reacted to a lot of the videos and photos at a lot of these peaceful assemblies.
That's the most ridiculous thing I've ever heard, dude.
You know, all the vandalism and the destruction of property. I think at UCLA, they just broke one of them up and a lot of trash was left behind. There was a lot of vandalism. I think I read that the students stole some of the construction materials like the plywood to build some of their barriers around their encampment, and the taking of buildings and the taking of hostages. Yeah, at Columbia, one of the buildings they took over, or the building they took over, they had a facility worker who claims that they held him hostage. Stuff like that. You know, that wasn't the problem. The problem was when police came to clean up these encampments and when counter-protesters arrived. And as we've seen, when universities have been a little too tolerant of these antics and have not done anything about it, you do run the risk of these things getting out of control. You run the risk of these things turning into chaos.
As well as professors and journalists and just random bystanders. The cumulative effect of all this coverage, along with some unverified assertions from police and politicians, has been to drive home the idea that student protests are basically a terrorist-level threat.
It's a bit of a straw man, I think.
That they have to be neutralized by battalions of cops armed like soldiers with MRAPs and sonic cannons. The reason this seems to me a reaction that's out of proportion to the protests themselves. Seems especially true.
It's out of proportion.
When you look at some other campuses like Brown University, where administrators negotiated with student protesters who took down their encampment, and Wesleyan University, whose president said the protesting there was nonviolent and non-disruptive, adding, as long as it continues in this way, the university will not attempt to clear the encampment. Now, these universities, crucially, have reiterated their important existing rules against anti-Semitic invective and harassment, certainly, while also protecting assembly, which seems sensible, also out of step with what you're seeing elsewhere. Because ever since October 7th, when Hamas committed its atrocities in Israel, there has been this obsessive media focus on college campuses. And that's true partly because there are genuine issues worth debating, including the degree to which universities are creating spaces that are hostile to pro-Israel Jewish students, where they feel under threat, or universities, the degree to which they're suppressing pro-Palestinian speech.
All right, so here I think is we're getting a bit of hedging. You know, after Chris Hayes, he downplayed some of the violence. He at least acknowledges that there has been some anti-Semitism and some Jewish students who might not feel safe and that it should be dealt with. Not to mention some non-Jewish students are not big fans. Like there was a student at UCLA who was taping what was going on and talking about what his experience was. And he was bringing up the fact that, one, UCLA has, I think, like a 9% acceptance rate. In other words, he had to work his ass off just to get into UCLA. Two, he pays good money to go to UCLA, and now he's, when he's trying to go to class, when he's trying to go to the library, he's being confronted by these little weasels who are trying to tell him where to go and telling him to not record people who have pitched tents on campus grounds. And they're trying to tell him where to go and that he can't record, and they're bothering him and telling him where he's allowed to walk and not allowed to walk and what he's allowed to record and not allowed to record.
And those issues really do matter. But the way that so many prominent voices have focused so exclusively on colleges feels honestly a bit decadent to me.
Yeah, it's a bit decadent, you guys.
Like we're doing a paper doll version of the conflict, because the actual reality of what's happening in Gaza is so horrific, unceasing, and high stakes. It's more enjoyable to argue about what college kids are doing than to confront the human misery and destruction that's happening in the actual conflict. That is, of course, the source of these protests.
Yeah, and again, so I did a video last week where I talked about how we did see a lot of blood and soil rhetoric. You know, all these chants of river to the sea. And how they don't want two states, they want all of it, and that the Jews have to go back to Poland and Europe or the U.S., just anywhere but Palestine. Similar blood and soil rhetoric that we've seen from Charlottesville. And now Christopher Hayes doesn't seem that interested. He feels like it's a bit decadent.
Oh, you absolutely suck!
And then there's the concern that many of these students are that are going along with the protests. They're cheering on Hamas and the Islamic Republic of Iran and the Al-Qassam brigades and Hezbollah. We've seen Hezbollah flags. You know, Chris Hayes, he was rightfully turned off by seeing all these Confederate flags. Doesn't really seem bothered by some of the Hezbollah flags that we've seen at multiple protests. And we've seen the cheering on of the destruction of Israel, and talking about how the plight of the Palestinians is part of some struggle to bring about a socialist reconstruction of the United States.
No offense, but it sounds like some fucking commie gobbledygook.
This all ignores the fact that these are college students, many of whom are at elite universities, Ivy League universities. Even a lot of the non-Ivy League universities like UCLA are pretty elite. Many of these students in the future, they're going to be politicians, court judges, lawyers, business executives, even like stuff like school teachers and journalists. They'll be on the nightly news like Mr. Hayes over here, influencing viewers. We're talking about people in 10 to 20 to 30 years who may be in real positions of power. And what are the long-term ramifications of that? Again, Chris Hayes was really concerned about the long-term ramifications of some of the protests that we saw at Charlottesville and all the blood and soil rhetoric, and how it might be poisonous to the Republican Party, if not inspire violence. He did a segment on this all the way back in 2022. And now that we're seeing some similar rhetoric on the left, especially from students who could conceivably be in real positions of power in 10, 20, 30 years, now Mr. Hayes is not too interested. He thinks it's a bit decadent to talk much about. Yeah, Chris Hayes, who would not apply this lack of scrutiny to tiki torch asshats and their blood and soil rhetoric. As I pointed out in my video last week, you're seeing a lot of this blood and soil rhetoric on college campuses with a river to the sea chants.
Blow it out your ass.
But I guess now Chris Hayes, he thinks it's a bit decadent. Wants to divert your attention away from all these protests where we're seeing anti-Semitism. I mean, he'll acknowledge that there's some anti-Semitism, but, worrying about it, talking about it, it's a bit decadent.
Oh, you absolutely suck!
What a goof.
What seems most worth debating isn't campus speech, but whether the U.S. government should continue to fund and support an Israeli war in Gaza that has pushed more than 1 million people to the brink of famine, a war that has damaged half of the building.
Now, he brings up the fact that, a lot of people, they're just concerned about the U.S. and the taxpayer supporting Israel in this war. And I think a lot of the talk about, this just about, they just don't want their tax dollars funding war. At least from the college activists, I think this is a bit of a red herring. If that's what the protests were really about, then why not go to your congressional rep's office or organize marches on Washington, D.C. to put pressure on members of Congress who, pass laws that approve aid to Israel, which I'm not opposed to cutting off Israel from aid. I'm for selling them weapons, that's fine, but giving them money, giving them material support. From what I can tell, Israel does not need charity from the United States. They're a rich country that can finance their own defenses. What I think Israel needs is some moral support. In other words, the president of the United States not telling them things like taking the win when the Islamic Republic of Iran launches attacks on them.
Oh, you absolutely suck!
But again, I think a lot of this stuff, they just don't want their tax dollars going to... I think it's a bit of a red herring from what I've seen from a lot of these protests.
In Gaza, a war that has failed to bring home most of the hostages held by Hamas, that has fact and led to the death of some of those hostages, as well as the deaths of an estimated 34,000 Palestinians, including roughly 10,000 women and 13,000 children. Is that ongoing effort more?
Now, I do want to also add to the fact that one of the big defenses for these, peaceful assemblies is, these activists, these students, why do you got to be so hard on them? They're just anti-war. They're just protesting genocide that's going on in Gaza. And I'm definitely getting this vibe from Hayes, although to his credit, he's not, throwing around the G word. But I do see this a lot. Going back to the Axios article that I talked about last week in my video where, these students talks about what the pro-Palestinian protesters are demanding, what they want. And you see here at Princeton, they have called on the school to issue a statement supporting a permanent ceasefire and condemning Israel's genocidal campaign. Stuff like collateral damage in a war is not the same thing as genocide. And on top of that, I think we need to stop giving people who loosely throw around the G word this big benefit of doubt. This is a big reason why I brought up the white nationalism and the great replacement stuff earlier. Which, it's like the anti-Israeli asshats. They like to throw around the G word when talking about great replacements and immigration policies. Because I do think Hayes is applying a bit of a double standard here. Imagine a scenario where the tiki torch carriers. Imagine a scenario where these tiki torch carriers were showing up to the universities, setting up encampments, pitching tents, taking over buildings, and taking hostages and harassing Jewish students, and demanding that their universities cut off business relations with Israel, because after all, as we know with white nationalist types, going back to David Duke's favorite member of Congress, they're not big fans of Israel. Not big fans of the country of Israel, but on top of that, they might demand stuff like ending foreign exchange programs, and they might demand that universities stop accepting immigrants into the university because from their point of view, the university, by engaging with immigration programs, from their view, that's genocide. Do we think that Chris Hayes, if that were to happen, if the tiki torch carriers were doing this shit that we're seeing from anti-Israel asshats on college campuses throughout America right now, do we think Chris Hayes would be getting on the nightly news and pussyfooting around and talking about, this is a tradition with college activism? as he diverts everyone's attention away from the activists and their antics. Do we think Chris Hayes would be doing shit like this? My guess is... It's pretty convenient for Mr. Hayes over here.
Morally defensible? Is it strategically wise? Are we as a nation doing the right or wrong thing and continuing to support it? Now, whenever that becomes a question, it almost becomes reflexive to challenge the questioner. And I can't help but think of the protests that marked the lead up to the Iraq War, which were both widely attended and widely attacked. And many, many prominent war supporters, including one-time student protester Christopher Hitchens, blasted those demonstrations. And he pointed to the fact that some of the people organizing the protests held genuinely odious and fringe views. For instance, the view that North Korea is a worker's paradise and a great place. That's a horrible view. There were protest organizers with bad views, lots of them. There were people at the protest with terrible views. There were people who thought 9/11 was an inside job. I would argue with them myself at protests.
And, we're getting more hedging here. Chris Hayes, presenting himself as kind of a fair and balanced, nuanced guy. More hedging. Hey, all protests have some bad actors with some horrible goals, but, what can you do?
Did that have anything to do at all with whether the war in Iraq was moral and prudent? No. The war in Iraq demonstrably was neither. On that, the protesters were right. Which brings us back to Columbia University, where 56 years ago, almost to the day, student protesters took over the same building, Hamilton Hall, that was occupied earlier this week. They, too, were forcibly removed and arrested. Many were bloodied and beaten for protesting, among other things, the university's involvement in the Vietnam War.
All right, so I'm seeing a lot of this as of late, not just from Mr. Hayes, but a lot. I think Norman Finkelstein was trying to connect today's protest with the Vietnam War era protests. And I think the comparisons to the Vietnam War protests and even the Iraq War protests, sort of apples and oranges. The Vietnam War was a war that America was waging, where American troops, young Americans, were being sent over to Vietnam when America had no business being over there. Vietnam was not a national security threat to the United States. And even worse, there was a draft where young men were forced to go and fight in Vietnam. Compare that with some of the protests that we're seeing at UCLA, according to this article on what is this? This is the Daily News. They issued a list of demands last week calling for a divestment of all University of California and UCLA Foundation funds from companies tied to Israel, along with a demand that the university call for an immediate and permanent ceasefire in the Israeli-Hamas war and begin an academic boycott against Israeli universities, blah, 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 blah. Going back to Vietnam, you could... It's conceivable that a lot of the students that were protesting, put aside some of the antics that went beyond the realm of peaceful assembly. It was a lot more legitimate because I imagine a lot of people, a lot of college students, they probably had friends and relatives who were enlisting in the military voluntarily or getting forced into the military and getting sent to Vietnam, getting their hands tied behind their back with rules of engagement to fight a war of attrition. And even with Iraq, America was directly involved. American troops were directly involved, not to mention the taxpayer cost, the cost of the taxpayers for these wars. U.S. troops were going over there, and I don't know. I'm not sure this is exactly the same as activists pitching tents, taking over buildings, taking hostages, harassing students, all in the hopes of getting universities to issue statements calling for Israel to cease fire, which I don't imagine is going to accomplish much, and is also telling that these demands are not issued at Hamas, but also divesting from Israel's war efforts, which according to this piece on the Wall Street Journal on April 25th by Matt Barnum and Juliet Chung, protesters are demanding colleges divest from Israel. Here's why that is not happening. And at one point it mentions how one of the demands, one of the, in their minds, what constitutes as funding the war in Israel, or funding, the G word in Gaza. It includes, Columbia University, investing in companies like Google, Amazon, and Microsoft because they merely provide cloud services for the Israeli government and military. This is what they have in mind. So yeah, I'm not sure that, the United States being directly involved in wars where they're sending thousands of troops, in the case of Vietnam, conscripting, drafting. I'm not sure if it's the same thing as demanding universities cut ties with Microsoft and Amazon. And symbolic victories like issuing condemnations and demanding ceasefires.
They believed the war was a moral catastrophe and the U.S. should stop waging it. They were right. And the fact that there were absolutely genuine extremists among those protesters in '68, again, had no bearing on whether they were right or not about that. What I find particularly maddening about our focus on the protesters of the conflict is that it's an evasion. It avoids the
evasion, huh?
Difficult task of being...
This guy's one to accuse others of evading.
Universally empathetic to our fellow human beings and truly reckoning with the scale of devastation that is wrought by our country in our names with our support. In the aftermath of 9/11, we waged a global war on terror for 2 decades that killed an estimated 430,000 people, many of them children, women, elderly, innocents. In Vietnam, we are estimated to have killed more than 1 million people, huge swaths of them civilians, women, children, male non-combatants, old people, and the like. Can you even make sense of those numbers? I can't. No one can.
I might be picking nits here, but I find it interesting that he's not mentioning the thousands of Americans who died in these wars, especially Vietnam, when, again, a lot of these men were forced into military service.
It's hard to think of them, to contend with them as actual real human beings who lived lives before he took them, who are people like you or I, who were loved by the people in their lives. It is much easier to get angry at the spoiled brats on college campuses. Why are they being so disruptive? What are they so upset about? If you feel that way, which I can understand, honestly, I felt irritation and anger at protesters many times in my life, even ones I was ostensibly on the same side as, broadly speaking.
See, he sometimes gets upset at protesters, even ones that, he's on the same side as. He's this guy, Mr. Hayes, he's fair and balanced.
If you feel that way, just try recasting the question. Why are all these...
But also, if you're worried about some of these protests and some of the troubling things that are being said at these protests, well, that's a little bit decadent. I guess the only protests that you're allowed to care about are white nationalist rallies. And not rallies from the left that, they share same sentiment. They engage in blood and soil rhetoric when talking about Israel versus Palestine. They engage with anti-Semitism. They engage with conspiracy fantasies.
People so upset that we're helping a government wage a brutal war that's killed 13,000 children.
And also, again, earlier, Hayes, he did segments talking about how a lot of this dangerous rhetoric is poisoning one of the 2 major political parties. Does he seem interested in the impact that a lot of these horrible ideas and activist shitheads, what impact they might be having on the current Democratic Party? No concern there? No concern that this might lead to violence? I mean, we definitely see it lead to violence in the Middle East with how Hamas and Hezbollah and the Houthis engage in terrorism.
The question kind of answers itself. To take seriously the scale of human suffering that's happening in Gaza doesn't mean you must come down the side of the protesters, certainly. There are many people who think the war is a brutal but necessary campaign for Israel's defense. What it does necessitate is that you weigh all the human suffering against the actual end game of the conflict that is currently being waged and is unarticulated as of now. A conflict the U.S. continues to support. Our humanity demands we focus on those questions first and last.
Yeah, those are the most important questions. So I do hesitate to comment on stuff like military strategy as it's happening for a variety of reasons. One notable reason is fog of war, which has definitely been a problem since October 7th. We've seen some misreporting in the media. But I'm also not an expert on military strategy, and even a couple weeks ago, I was on a show on the Ayn Rand Center UK YouTube channel where one of the panelists was claiming that the IDF was taking way longer than it should in Gaza, and that some experts had plans that would have wrapped up this war months ago. I've seen some other reports that suggest that the Israeli military is frustrated. They're fed up with Bibi Netanyahu because of his indecisiveness on conducting this war. Not sure how true that is. Also, I'm not an expert in Israeli politics. So maybe Hayes has a point when he says there does not seem to be any clarity on what the end goal is. Not to mention the indecisiveness of the Biden administration in regards of Israel. But what I think Hayes is doing well here, and not in a good way, but what he's doing well is he's playing into altruism. Hayes wants you to not focus on what's going on college campuses or some of the horrible rhetoric, some of the horrible antics that we're seeing from these peaceful assemblies and their long-term implications. He draws your attention to the suffering and the destruction that is going on in Gaza, and he wants you to think about that first. It's the people of Gaza that we need to think about first, because after all, that's what altruism demands. And I often talk about how altruism is often brought into economic policy, and I often point out how talking about the consequences and long-term implications of bad economic policies, how it often has the opposite consequence of its desired result. When you articulate this to people who advocate for such policies, it often does not stick. It often does not convince people because, that's the beauty of altruism. You don't have to think. You don't have to think long-term or consider long-term consequences when you're doing the right thing. I even saw Project Liberal fall into this trap. I think this was just today with this meme. This meme that shows communism theory looks all fine and dandy. Communism in practice looks like a shadow, a silhouette of someone hanging. Not to pick on this account because I do like a lot of their content, but this sort of gives the game away. It sort of cedes moral high ground to the communists when you suggest that their stupid, murderous theory is, it's fun in theory. It's just horrible in practice.
Oh, you absolutely suck!
But going back to Chris Hayes and the demands of these college students and these activist asshats, what are the long-term implications of Israel caving to the demands of college activists in America, which would presumably allow Hamas to remain in power? It would mean Hamas keeping its boots on the necks of everyone in Gaza. It would mean more attacks on Israel and more innocents in Israel getting killed. And since Hamas is the government of Gaza, it's worth noting that they are responsible. It is they who are responsible for the protection of civilians in Gaza, which according to this report on the Wall Street Journal from February 29th, Hamas is losing every battle in Gaza. It still thinks it could win the war. This was written by Marcus Walker, Anat Paled, and Summer Saeed. Not going to read the whole article, just a few lines. Talks about how when a courier arrived with a message from Yahya Sinwar, the head of Hamas in Gaza, said, in effect, do not worry, we have the Israelis right where they want them. Adding that Hamas fighters, the Al-Qassam brigades, were doing fine, the upbeat message said. The militants were ready for Israel's expected assault on Rafah, a city on Gaza's southern edge. High civilian casualties would add to the worldwide pressure on Israel to stop the war, Sinwar's message said, according to people informed about the meeting. And the article goes on to say that the goal for Hamas is to emerge from the rubble of Gaza after the war, declare a historic victory by outlasting Israel's firepower, and claim the leadership of the Palestinian national cause. And I'm inclined to believe this, considering that according to Hamas's original covenants, death for the sake of Allah is the loftiest of its wishes. So it's Hamas that has endangered the innocents in Gaza to the extent that they're innocent and not actively supporting Hamas's war effort, which according to various polls and surveys since October 7th, it looks like Hamas still enjoys the support of the majority of people in Gaza. On the other hand, maybe a lot of these people are just saying that they support Hamas because, you know, Islamic totalitarian regimes like Hamas, they're not big fans of dissidents. They're not big fans of people who don't go along with their regime. And often there is a retribution for people who go against the grain in these Islamic totalitarian societies. And yet we see a lot of these activists on college campuses, you know, cheering on Hamas and the Al-Qassam brigades. I saw another video. It's hard to keep up with all these clips coming out from all these demonstrations. People calling Hamas liberators, which is just... All of the civilian casualties in Gaza are the responsibility of Hamas, who started this war and even before October 7th had a long history of launching rockets into Israel and launching terrorist attacks against Israel. And on top of that, Hamas refuses to surrender. So really the nicest thing that you could say about these peaceful assemblies is that they are incredibly stupid and misguided. And on top of that, they are breaking the law and attempt to get their universities to punish and condemn Israel, which probably will not accomplish much. And even if they're successful, even if this all ultimately resulted in Israel pulling out of Gaza and letting Hamas live to fight another day, it would not end the suffering in Gaza.